Is brutal.
I would like to start with a brief round of introductions for this extremely accomplished panel. Could you start? Could we start from Farah? Could we start with a quick round of introductions?
Hi. Okay, introductions. I'm Farah. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm a feminist. And in my professional life, I lead ActionAid. I am an advocate for women's rights, climate justice, transformative justice, children's rights, and I love working with the young people.
Do I have to press something? Oh, no.
Hi, Adelle Nazrain here from America, and I have been a journalist for 12 years. I'm currently I've transitioned into international business. I'm also a fellow at a few think tanks, and my work is focused on international human rights, religious freedom, and really innovation and technology, helping women, men get to where they need to be, cultivating future leadership, not just in America, but the world over. I'm very, very honored to be here today at the inaugural session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Neuen. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure being with all of you, and I really appreciate the dialogue that's been taking place thus far. My background really started in the military professionally. Over the course of about 16 years, I've been in cybersecurity and governance, risk, and compliance roles. More recently, an adjunct professor at the University of New Hampshire School of Law, teaching specifically around blockchain and blockchain for social impact and blockchain for data privacy and security. I started my own company that really sits at the intersection of the social implications of technology and how we leverage that for a better future of work. That's my company, EmpirEqual. That's our mission and my personal passion. Thank you so much for having me in the conversation.
Is this on?
Yeah, I think it's on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Champa Patel. I'm the head of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. But prior to Chatham House, I worked for 10 years for Amnesty International, working in the field of international human rights. And then prior to that, I'm showing my age here now, another 10 years in healthcare as a frontline health worker. So it's a great privilege to be able to be here and share experiences about navigating these issues in different policy contexts.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you so much. So for our audience, the focus of this session is to talk about the enablers for women leadership in what has traditionally been seen as an old boys club. Policy and politics is a new arena for women. We see a lot of changes that are happening both internationally and specific to the Indo-Pacific region. The first question I would like to pose, and it's open-ended to my panelists, is if we had seen 2,000 years of matriarchy or of gender equality instead of the very patriarchal society that we've grown up in, what do you think would be different? How do you think the world would be different? We can start with you, Farah.
A very interesting question. And first of all, thank you to all of you for being with us, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. If we had 2,000 years of patriarchy, I think we would still suffer from power dynamics and autocracy because we get too confident and not necessarily inclusive. So the answer to patriarchy is not matriarchy, but feminism, the feminist values of justice. And I think if we had that for the last 2,000 years or even 200 years, then today we would be inclusive. We would see the diversity in leadership, in policy, in politics. Because even now when we come across legislation, policies, and politics, it serves it comes with a particular dimension. Sometimes it's parochial, sometimes it's unipolar. It's not inclusive. So that would have been different.
I happen to think that women have certainly been very powerful and intrinsic, and I'd say one of the primary leaders behind the scenes in terms of how history has been depicted for the last 2,000 years. they've definitely been at the fold, at the center, and at the forefront of the decision-making over the past 2,000 years, although they may have not received the credit for it with the media. And I think that is an issue that's come full circle today in the 21st century with the media's depiction of the reality on the ground versus how they would like their narrative to present what they think should be the narrative they'd like to present. So I think if women had been given more credit and credence for their tremendously important role, not only in the nuclear family structure, but also in the workplace and influencing their significant others and men in their decision-making, there may be today very much more opportunity for women because the culture would have changed. As we know, culture is downstream from politics and policy. And so I think, just to make a long-winded answer kind of shorter, what we're seeing today is an absolutely a tremendous change in the culture. And the culture is what's going to end up affecting the policies in the present and the future that are going to help women soar to new levels without forgetting and without leaving behind their male counterparts. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and really take a slightly different perspective. I think all of the things that my fellow panelists said are true, yes, but if you look at history, if you look at how women perform on boards in companies, making, huge evidence-based cases for the fact that they are outperforming certain male-led companies, right? When you look at also women, in organizations as philanthropy, NGOs, etc., it is a very clear case to how they would lead in different areas, and they've typically been very, very collaborative and inclusive because women have sons, they have daughters, right? Our perspective, just by design, is much different than that of the male counterparts that we have. And I say this, again, fully acknowledging that full gender equality cannot be reached without bringing along and celebrating our male allies and counterparts, right? But I do think that there is something special and unique about the value proposition that women have to bring to both industry and, and government organizations.
That's a wonderful perspective.
I think I'm with Farah on this because, there are anthropological studies done which show in matriarchal societies, there's some evidence that suggests there are more flatter ways of exercising power, so more collective decision-making, more collaboration. But equally, there are studies that show, in a sense, if you flip the genders, the same power dynamics remain. And I wonder if this value proposition that we bring is different and unique because we have been systematically excluded. Now, if it was a matriarchy and it was women in charge, what's to say that we wouldn't exhibit those behaviors too? So I think, in a way, to imagine that world is difficult because I think the idea that somehow more women equates more progressive policies or more progressive outcomes, I don't think is so linear. And I think it is more around how do you inculcate values of social justice, equality, inclusion, in a way that brings in everybody regardless of their background. Because I think the other thing is when we talk about women, we're not a homogenous group. And I think depending on where you were born, how you grew up, the cultures that you were exposed to, if I think about my life, I'm working class, I'm female, I'm of Indian origin, and I'm all of these things at the same time. And sometimes one of these things may be more prevalent than the others. Growing up in the UK in the 1970s, racism was more of an issue, frankly, than being a woman. But then in the working environment, in the home environment, being a woman was more of an issue because of the pressure to get married.
Yes.
So I think, it's to recognize that women hold multiple identities, and really depending on your context, what we don't want to do is have one subsume all the others.
Absolutely. Thank you. Farah, this is another question to you. So, according to a World Bank project on women, business, and the law, there are only 6 countries in the world that have a legal framework regarding gender equality. Since you work a lot in policy and in legal processes, what kind of laws and legal framework do you think are required to improve the inclusiveness of women in this entire context? I think we need to switch the mic on. Yeah.
So in most countries, we have constitutions where there's a written constitution. It says it's equal for all. But then we find the society does not practice equality. So we need support from legislations, policies, and programs. And many of the countries, if you review, still have highly discriminatory laws. In my own country, we play with this notion of when it comes to the personal, it is the ethnicity, your religious group that you belong to supersedes the equality framework in the Constitution. So that is problematic, because then immediately with all the equal policies or opportunities immediately kicks in the personalized law or legislation. And therefore, if I was to marry someone, I would be dictated by, because I'm a Muslim. If I was a Hindu, it would be the Hindu law. If I was a Christian. So that is where we need to invest. Then we have policies. Now, if I speak from South Asia, because that's where I've been working a lot, there's some amazing policies that have come because of all the advocacy and lobbying we have done since or before Beijing and in the last 25 years. But there's no implementation. And if there's a lot of rhetorics, and all politicians will come to us as women voters or as their constituency when they need us, and then they go back to their usual business as usual. And they're very comfortable in it because they will talk about the other constituency, which can be conservative, which can be regressive, which may then become more, get a greater clout than the rest of us, because women for various reasons have not been so well organized. But we can see the changes coming. And your head of the government or the state can be a woman, but still has to play the game as per the patriarchy or the male boys club. So that's a problem. And I think affirmative measures, let us not shy away from affirmative measures. I mean, now we have a tendency of talking about gender mainstreaming. I have no problem with that, except in my 30 years of work, it has not changed the conditions of the women. So let's talk about gender mainstreaming and talk about women's rights, the rights of the young people, the rights of the adolescents, and have affirmative measures. We need to set some targets, and we need to be accountable to them.
Thank you. So, Adelle, my question to you is slightly different. Given the fact that we talk a lot about affirmative measures, where does meritocracy actually start to play a role?
So thank you for the question. I happen to think that there's, if I may, I'd like to quote Milton Friedman, reference him with this. According to him, there are 3 different ways that people are considered to be equal: equality before God, equality of opportunity, and equality of outcome. And I think that what everyone could agree on is that equality before God and equality of opportunity are really the most, the best ways to approach it. I think where the whole gender equality question really is messed up is when it comes to equality of outcome. That in and of itself intrinsically leads itself to, I think, more socialist principles, which innately suggest that everyone is literally equal. Everyone is literally the same. And that's where the problem comes into play, because not everyone is the same. One may have a different religious belief system that governs their moral or ethical eros. One may have a different, taste in, let's say, clothing or food that may help them decide what their dietary restrictions are. Moral values, ethical values. So I think that there definitely has to be an emphasis more on the opportunity, and I think that the United States, I hope this answers your question, really has been great in many ways, although still has a lot of ways to improve, but can be an excellent role model, especially with regard to the innovation of technology, to helping the rest of the world and also learning from the rest of the world how to better allow for the equality of opportunity to take place in areas where it is so sorely lacking. And so that's the long story short.
Sure.
Please do.
Affirmative measures does not mean it's devoid of meritocracy.
Absolutely.
So the premise on which this is framed, I think, has been for a long time is, affirmative measures undermines my... No, I will approve affirmative measures and still have to prove my caliber, my capacity, and my talent?
My question was actually more around the fact that affirmative measures can be seen as a forced sense of inclusivity. And that's actually my question to you, Lindsay. If we talk about affirmative measures being the method to reduce a barrier to entry, for example, reservation in parliament, reservation on corporate boards, does that promote gender equality? Because on the other side of the table, what you have is an entire, is 50% of the world or the rest of the male population starting to feel resentful of these affirmative policies. Does that actually promote equality and inclusivity in the long run? And what happens when these measures are removed? What happens when that crutch goes away?
I think this is, speaks to the danger and the criticality of actually not overlaying these blanket best practices from one country to the next, from one workplace to the next. What works in the US may very well not work for Bangladesh. You have to be so very aware of the cultural, technical, and systemic frameworks that you're operating within, and that differs. And I think that when you have things like quotas in academia or quotas in boards to supplement that, and this is at a high level, to supplement that with very clear performance metrics that are clear across the board and make no qualms about the fact that people are performing, no matter how they got into the position, at the same level or sometimes outperforming, actually highlighting the accomplishments of women are as important as getting them into these roles, because it reinforces the story that they belong here, no matter what path that they had to chart to actually get there.
Sure. Absolutely.
So I have to say also, adding to what you were saying, that as innovation and technology happens and you see more automation entering the workforce, this is not meant to slight anyone, but women tend to be just better at handling complex issues. So the more complex issues in the workplace will actually lend itself to having more female hires, I think. So that's just a comment that I have to say about that.
Interesting. So Daisy, Champa, this is for you now. You mentioned that as a woman, you've got multiple identities, and growing up in the UK in what was probably a troubling racial period has also shaped a lot of the experiences that you've had. So it's interesting that a lot of studies have shown that the ability of minorities, which includes both women as well as racial minorities, to have an impact are largely driven by the mechanism of circumstance, which means role models, effective exposure and education in career selection, and finally in network effects. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I just want to touch on some of what was said before and bring it in with this, because in some regards I agree and disagree with what's been shared. I think actually equality of opportunity is absolutely key, because it's not equality, equality before God really depends on whether you believe in God, right? I mean, I'm an atheist, but so I think design and policies, it's not about leveling the playing field, it's about giving opportunities to women that have not had those opportunities before. I'm a beneficiary of that, in the sense that nobody in my family has education post-14. I was the first person to go on to do GCSEs and then et cetera, degrees, et cetera. And part of that was because there were scholarships for ethnic minority students that I was able to apply for. In the absence of that, I'm from a very working class family, there would have been no money to pay for education. I wouldn't have gone. The norm in the family was people got married at 17 or 18. So I think equality of opportunity, policies that allow groups that are not able, not just women, but groups that are not able to access those spaces or those opportunities, that's the sort of policies we should be designing. And I think in that regard, I'm not sure what's meant by socialist policies, but I think this idea that everybody should be able to have the opportunities to achieve what they want to achieve, irregardless of their race, their gender, their financial background, is absolutely key. Now, I think for me, growing up, there wasn't really role models. You didn't see Asians on the television screens. There weren't many high-profile women. But But I think the interesting thing is if you're of South Asian heritage, we have a history of female prime ministers, right? So I think in a way, the rest of the world maybe needs to look at us to see that actually way before Western countries had female leaders, South Asia had female leaders. I'm not saying they were good leaders, but
Leaders, yes.
in the sense they were female leaders. So I think it's interesting then to think through that, not having visible role models, not being able to tap into those networks, I think was hugely detrimental. If I look at my sister who's 10 years younger, she grew up in an environment where there were just much more prominent Asian women. We were on the televisions, they were political figures. Her going to university was not even a question. I mean, I left school with 3 GCSEs. I messed up big time. So I don't think anybody thought I had any kind of academic career ahead of me. But the expectation when she took a gap year, everybody was so angry that she didn't go to university. So the flip from 10 years from when I wanted to go, and there was huge family rows, drama, oh, you're going to get married to a white guy, you're going to come back with a baby, all this sort of, kind of hyperbole because I wanted to go to university. 10 years later, the generation and the culture had moved on. So one thing I want to say is you can't legislate culture. That's why I don't think policies and laws are enough by themselves. So I think it's having those, and actually a lot of countries have very good laws. The problem is nobody implements them. So I think the idea of kind of, how do we have an ecosystem where you have the right laws, but you have a culture of accountability, where you have equality of opportunity, so you can have the role models, where you are able to tap into networks to meet people from different backgrounds that you can learn from. I don't need to meet people like me. I need to learn from other people to see how have they fostered resilience, what have they learned along their journeys, what can I take away from them that's inspiring to me. So I think it's about celebrating difference, not necessarily having everybody have the same, but that only comes through having equality of opportunity.
Thank you. That was a wonderful... Yes.
There's a saying that, when we have work in the organization, we develop strategies and then we come back and try to change, and we're told that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, it's interesting because culture is also not static.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because living in this part of the world, in the last 30 years, we have seen so many cultures intruding, and within those religious communities, the interpretation of religious practices have also changed. So when we talk about culture not changing easily, yes, but culture can also become the weapon in the hands of patriarchy.
Yes.
And it can be heavily used to oppress women. Because we don't see the same in terms of behavior or cultural practices for our male gender. But it's always about women, because we are the guardian of everything under the sun. Your culture, your religion, your family, your food, your health.
Your
Your morality, we are the guardian. But somehow you suffer from such insecurity that you always try to have an upper hand, control that very constituency or community or gender. Who is the custodian of all your values and morality and practices? So there's a contradiction in society, because I think society does not like people to live in peace. If there is no conflict and no fear, how do you control and overpower them? That is the mantra of all those in authority, irrespective of whether it's in your home or in the community or in the state. Fear and control.
If I may just add to that, I don't think it's society that, you raised some very great points that I agree with, and I think that society does want peace. I think it's the media that's presenting a different narrative. No, I actually think that media is separate from society. I do not think that media represents society. I think media has failed to adequately represent society. And coming from 12 years of that, I have seen the steady decline of the way the media has perceived society. So I think that that is a place where it has to absolutely be addressed and changed.
I don't think we have enough time for that. So,
Except that Rupert Murdoch has done us. That's all I wanted to say.
the next thing I wanted to talk about was women's responsibility to each other. And Farah, the first question would be sort of posed to you. a biography of Mrs. Indira Gandhi that I was reading a few weeks ago talks about her upbringing. And the fact that because she didn't grow up in a house with male siblings, she was never fundamentally taught that there was a difference between a man and a woman. From a responsibility perspective, or from how women treat other women, it should start at home. And maybe it's about mothers teaching their daughters that they are equivalent to their sons. And that could spur an entire new generation of people who don't even think gender equality is a debatable issue. And maybe the seeds of that need to be sown in from the time the children are very young. What are your views on that?
I cannot but agree with you. I grew up in a family with my brother is 7 years younger, and we never realized that there was a gender difference. That's how, because it was more about education and knowledge and learning. I have 2 sons, and my sons have grown up, and I'm very proud of them, because for them it's all about just and justice. So in terms of, again, we are putting the responsibility on the mother. And her upbringing. Now, a mother is a woman who's come out of this society where her status is always vulnerable and fragile. When she's born, she's, oh my God, another daughter. You don't celebrate. Then she's, especially in many countries, Asia, it's like, when do you get married? Because you're a burden, so I have to transfer this burden over to somebody else. So my whole life is, why was I born? I have no value addition. I am a burden. I need to be transferred to somebody else. Then when I'm transferred, where you have come into somebody else's premise and home, and your acceptability is when you have a son, when you give birth to a son. When I used to work in the communities, because of my upbringing, it took me a long time to understand, because the women in the community said, you don't understand, you've given birth to 2 sons. I said, so what? But then I realized, I went to Tihar jail, and I found in Tihar jail, I was with Kiran Bedi, and she took me to see these women, 200 women under trial, and they had all come because of bride burning. So I asked these women, how? How do you do it? She said, we don't know. We just know that it's acceptable. And that was my way of getting acceptance into this family. So imagine how our brains and our orientation are. So yes, we must teach our children the value of respecting human beings. And then there's no differences other than the biological differences, which is not a disadvantage. In fact, I, being a woman, nature gave me the responsibility to reproduce and bring somebody to this world. Most of the men here would not have been there without a mother and a woman. So I should have that confidence, and yes, we need to teach our girls confidence, because instead of bringing that story, don't smile, don't laugh, don't do this, don't do that, we should say, do all that is right, what you think is right, and pursue your dreams.
That's a wonderful perspective. Adelle, would you like to add to that?
It is adding on. It is wonderful. Adding on to that, I come from a very similar background, but also slightly different in that I was actually with I'm the oldest child and a daughter, and I have a younger brother and younger sister, and my younger brother was afforded tremendously more freedoms than I was. And so I was expected to kind of have, from the Persian background, which is very similar to Indian actually, this traditional upbringing, be married by a certain age, and I wasn't having it because I was like, I'll have both, but I'm going to have it on my terms. And so it was a very big work in progress. My parents are wonderful human beings, but I come from this tremendously traditional background and culture where I had to break my own barriers and to kind of forge a path forward for leadership in my own right. And it worked out tremendously well, but I did face my own set of challenges, being that there was an unequal view of how a woman was perceived as being versus a male. So I'm very grateful that I had that upbringing because it helps me appreciate the struggle of other women and what they've had to overcome to really get to where they are today. So,
right. Thank you. I actually wanted to continue the conversation, Adelle. What do you think about balance? When we talk about gender equality, when we talk about, we have many different perspectives. We have the feminist perspective, which is all about improving inclusiveness. We have there is an entire an entire generation of men who are now growing resentful because of, conversations about meritocracy. When being a role model to another woman, to a younger person in the same field, how would you strive to maintain balance in perspective?
Thank you. Speaking personally, I can tell you that I never had any I was always the one, and I still am, someone who loves to mentor and to help other women to get to where they need to be. Unfortunately, I was not as fortunate to have women, for the most part, who were interested in doing the same for me, so I had to forge my own path again. I think that this whole equality thing is very, apologies, very important, and men have to realize that if they don't already, and it's a woman's responsibility, of course, as you've mentioned, and we are the bearers of life, and we have even more responsibility to take on the two tasks, right? The work life, the home life. So I think that it's critically important for women to teach their sons that not only are they, having their own role, but also that they're supposed to play a supportive role, frankly, for the women in their lives, the woman in their life. And that is the key to empowering women. I think that in the United States, for example, feminine has taken on a very different tone and essence than how it has in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I think there's something called third wave. Feminism has served its purpose in America, and it's continuing to, and it's beautiful. Unfortunately, personally, I think this third wave feminism that has taken hold is really detrimental, because I think it's an all-out war on men and masculinity. That's what I'm saying. They call it third wave feminism, and it's not exactly. Thank you. It's not feminism. It's hatred, and it's actually deteriorating society. But I think feminism absolutely needs to come to other parts of the world, and it is, and that's why I say that while you mentioned earlier that the model in America culturally for what feminism is may not exactly fit in with Southeast Asia or other parts of the world, but there are elements that can be extracted and enhanced as part of society. So feminism is sorely needed in other parts of the world. So I hope that answers your question. Yes.
I actually want to just add to that. And I think that we have to take it from, we owe it to people to take it from a high level to tactical things that they could implement in their own businesses, in their own lives, right? So when you say, oh, I think that we should make way for women in the workplace, what does that actually mean? I think doing things like flexible work, right? Making sure that possibly enabling remote work, or implementing policies that are progressive enough to have women have enough time after pregnancy and be able to return to a job that they can feel secure that they're not going to be penalized for that. I think in government, it comes in the form of creating funds and programs with public-private partnerships and enterprise to really lay the framework and the groundwork for promoting women in the workplace, going beyond financial inclusion to financial empowerment, so that men's and women's income rates are rising at the same time, right? We know that rising tide does not lift all ships without some effort, right, to actually address the hurdles to that in a very intentional way. And I think talking about, again, even just the unconscious bias that we bring to a situation, identifying your own personal biases, because everyone has them, right, is the first step in becoming a more empathetic and effective human being and a leader, right? It's doubly so when you start rising to the position of a mentor, of a regulator, to check your own biases early and often, because they develop very naturally and they are extremely detrimental to progress, right? Talking about women's empowerment and all of these things without recognizing the nuance. Absolutely. Again, talking about the cultural issues that impede that, like child marriage, or again, the negative narrative that women have, the negative perception that there is when women go against the norm or step out of their place. We need to develop a counter narrative that not only starts in the home for our daughters and our sons to be able to repeat back and to be armed with, but also make sure that they're surrounded in their friend circles, in their schools, in the mentors that are in their lives with language and ideals that are just as affirming, because it's systemic. It starts in the home, sure, but it is either, enforced or derailed by the things that they see in the world and in the workplace.
Can I just...
Sure, absolutely.
Just to touch on what others have said, I think it's interesting to use that Indira Gandhi quote, because she may not have grown up with male siblings, but she grew up with dynastic power.
Absolutely.
So I think we have to recognize the privilege can exist. This idea somehow that she knows about gender equality because she didn't grow up with siblings when she grew into one of the biggest dynasties India has known is kind of like, counterintuitive. But I want to question this idea of mentorship, because it implies some kind of hierarchy. And I think in life, it's like that framing of the mother teaching their family. I'm not a mother. So I think what's incumbent on me is, as a human being, how do I engage with other human beings to make sure that I'm open to hearing what they have to say and learning from their experiences. So I think for me, it's about how do we adopt an approach that isn't saying, I'm somebody who's accomplished so much, I have so much to give to you, you can learn so much from me, because I'm still learning. So I think it's how do you build the skills to have those kind of conversations where you can learn from other people no matter what stage you are in life. Some of the young people I work with are deeply inspirational. I take a lot of energy away from what they're doing. I learn a lot from what they're doing. Their battles are different to what I had to fight back then. But I think it's more like how do you have a dialogue around those issues than these casting people into roles. I think it's problematic to say as a mother, as a something, as a mentor. But as human beings, how do we engage with each other to have these conversations?
To your question, that dialogue is so important, but it is also, again, something that we need to pay close attention to, because surrounding ourselves with people who will only reinforce our own beliefs is not going to extract the true value of dialogue. In my own company, I sometimes do small but effective things like appoint somebody as the devil's advocate, right? Where you counter everything that we say, right? To make sure you're poking holes in the logic there. Also, just around inclusion in meetings. Sometimes we get women into organizations, but then they're excluded from high-level decisions, right? Making sure that as a male ally or as a woman, if they're not a diversity of ideals represented in a meeting, you say, I think that we should reconvene when we have a quorum. These tactical things are going to be critical to taking this rhetoric, right, beyond lip service and actually changing it, making sure we're not discussing the same thing at this conference in 5 years.
Sorry, if I may just add one more thing.
Absolutely.
Great. Before, your comment about not being physically a mother in the traditional sense of it, I happen to think that I'm not a mother yet myself. I look forward to it someday, hopefully, if I'm blessed. But I think that you don't have to necessarily be a mother physically to a child to be seen as a mother figure to, for example, your students. Mr. Samir Saran was telling us earlier about his sister's incredible impact on her students in New York and how she is essentially a mother figure for them. And so mentorship, mothership, it doesn't have to be in the traditional, let's say, definition of the word, but more so in terms of the way that you can impact and imprint values and principles on any person in your life.
Yeah, but I think the reason I resist that is because, I'm the first generation and I'm the oldest as well. So growing up, you're told your purpose in life is to get married. That's what I was told. So I resist that because I think I'm not here to be somebody's mother. I'm here to share my experiences. I'm here to learn from their experiences. But I really resist that kind of categorization because it plagued my life for so long when I was young that it was only seen through the lens of, well, why do you want to go to university? There's no point. You're going to get married.
You're doing beautifully.
Exactly. So I think it's more like, I think that language matters in terms of how we portray ourselves.
Absolutely.
I just want to...
Sorry, we're actually running out of time, so I have to open the conversation for some questions. What I would like to say at the end of this session is we've debated a lot about feminism, about gender equality, and about the requirement to elevate women to a status where they now feel included, not just in processes, but also in decision-making and in leadership. One thing I think the session would be incomplete without mentioning is for every one of us who's had disastrous experiences with the men in our lives or in our careers, we have also had an entire series of men, whether it's partners, bosses, colleagues, who have not allowed us, but who have boosted us forward and who have helped us break those traditional patriarchal boundaries and take it forward. And I think that they deserve acknowledgement at the end of this session as well. With that, I'd like to open this up to the questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
I'm Fazlul Haq, Vice President Council and also Chairman, Jatiya Tarun Sangh, the National Youth and Social Council of Bangladesh. Before I start my question, I salute to Farah Kabir Appa, not only for women, but the wonderful works he's doing for the younger generation. I remember the words of our national poet, Nazrul Islam, that he told a Bishir Jakichu Kallan Kor, or Dek Tar Korea Thenari, or Dek Tannar, whatever good thing, 50% men and women. My question to all of you is that how we can empower more women. I want 50-50.
Yes.
My mother, father, and I'm a 50-50 family. Wife, husband, and one boy, one girl. How we can empower 50% equality, men and women, and what should we do in government, in NGOs, from grassroots level to national level? And is there need of legislation? In Bangladesh, women empowerment has, because we have the legislation,
Yes,
30% women, local government, even member of parliament, there's this. Thank you.
Yes, which one of our panelists would like to take that question? Okay. Sure. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name is Asta. I'm a researcher at the Observer Research Foundation. So I had a very general question.
Sorry, Farah, could I? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
No, could you speak up a little bit, please?
Is this better?
Yes. Yes.
So I think Lindsay sort of touched on it a little bit, the role of sort of men in taking this conversation forward. Of course, we're talking about gender mainstreaming in policy, and that these are debates we've heard before. But I think if you could just put a more light on this issue, that how can men become better allies? Because power structures are sort of entrenched currently in all spaces, and men dominate the space. So how can we sort of build that relationship and take it forward? This is to anyone who can answer.
All right, we'll take one more question.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. I would like to place a rather tantalizing proposal for affirmative action, and I wonder what will be your reaction to that proposal. Would we, as women's movement, consider creating a formula, for example, 40-40-20, and have reservations for men, 40%, for women, 40%, and the 20% will be like free radicals for jobs in private and public sector, and across the board, particularly in political decision making. Thank you.
So we have 3 questions.
May I?
I think that's all the time we have
okay, we
for
can
the
listen
questions.
to it.
Okay, sure.
Hello, hi. I have highest regards for all of you women. So thank you for having this conversation. I am Alisha Pradhan. So many of you know I run an innovative television that works for gender equality, Asia's first TV on women's well-being. So what I am facing constantly when I'm about to work for women's well-being, often than not, feminism or feminist termed as a negative word. And even if we talk about women empowerment, and my motto is to bring men together. The slogan is holding hands together with men. But men often say, oh God, it's a feminist, is it a man-hating things? My biggest concern right now, I guess for all of us, if we have to really bring the SDG achievement, how do we rebrand feminism? Because I love men. I love my father, my friends, and everyone. I have nothing against them. It's a human who is a man or woman doing the wrong things. So how do we rebrand feminism and make sure and ensure that our father figures or the mankind are with us in this? Thank you.
I think that's a really interesting question.
Hello, may I?
Sorry, we've actually just got a few minutes left, and I think...
If I may just
yes.
add to that, thank you so much. I just want to say, I think rebranding feminism, which is a point that you discussed also, third wave feminism is not really feminism. We have to listen more. I was speaking to a woman from Uganda here, wonderful lady, and very intelligent, and she said feminism in Uganda has become to the point where the women are no longer, they've outright dismissed their male counterparts. I think that what has to happen is the women have to also listen to hear what the men want and what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and then take that into accounting when they're also approaching them. And we've completely changed the dialogue has to change, basically. That's one of the solutions, I think.
I don't think feminism needs rebranding. Because do we understand what feminism is? Because feminism stands on the principles and values of justice, inclusion. There is no feminism which does not have those pillars. So feminism doesn't need branding. It's our mindset. And as usual, it is again being used as a weapon. Because that was like decades ago when we had the women bra burning and radical and so on. Any value, any ism has a radical version of it. But go in deeper into it. Because then, somebody can talk about we need to rebrand Christians, Muslims, Hindus, because we are seeing the extremism. That's not my point. So feminism does not need to be rebranded. Feminism needs to be understood and take the values, take the principles. Because if you are a human being, if you believe in humanism, if you believe in any ism that is inclusive, tolerant, and talks about people, then that is feminism. So it is what we have managed to do, because there is no one feminism now. We have the white feminism from the north, we have the black feminism, we have the Asian feminism. Why? Because people have managed to divide us. So let's come together, let's understand that feminism stands on certain values, and let us work on that. And the gentleman had a question about how do we bring more women. Basically, you have to talk to women as human beings. Do not tell them you should not be going out, you should not have a dream, you should not be wearing these clothes, you must have done something to be raped. Yeah, a three-year-old girl and a 5-year-old girl must have done something to be raped. So what we are doing in this society is tolerating violence, gender-based violence. Stop tolerating violence. Unless you stop tolerating violence, unless you stop celebrating violence, because your movies, your dramas, your songs celebrate violence, stop that, you will see the change. Women don't need to be given an extra hand. Women are competent. They understand that the skills, they're engineers, they're doctors, they're MBAs. Look at the group of women here. Forget about me, but look at the group. I mean, amazing people. Someone is leading a Chatham House, someone is from the corporate sector, from the media, so on. So women don't need that. It's just that don't put those shackles around us. Don't tell us you should be a good woman. How about telling men, why don't you be a just man?
I think
Can I just come in on that?
yes, sir.
Yeah, I was going to say, I couldn't agree more, because I think this idea that feminism needs rebranding speaks to the failure, actually, of the movement to communicate its goals. So I think we need to be better advocates at explaining the principles and the values that underpin our feminism, but we don't need to change what feminism is. It's very easy for people who are counter to these values to knock it down by saying, well, you're anti-this, you're anti-that. But that's the job of communicating through the media, through other channels, to say it's this. On affirmative action, I agree with affirmative action, but I don't agree with quotas. And I think the problem with quotas is it then can very easily become a tick box exercise. So I think, how do you develop policies that ensure greater inclusivity, but without getting stuck in a situation where you say X percentage are women, X percentage are men, because there's no guarantee that having X percentage of women means you have good women who are good at their jobs and are able to do that. Do you see what I mean? So I think it's like, I agree with affirmative action as a means to increase equality of opportunity, but I think quotas can be a problematic way forward, just in terms of how sometimes people actually go about fulfilling them. And in terms of men being better allies, I think it's going back to having stronger dialogue, people being more self-aware, people communicating their own experiences. So some of the measures that you've outlined, I think, are really practical ways in which men can be better allies. So I think there's a number of ways, but it has to start with, this idea that somehow we need to listen to men. We've been listening to men for a very long time. Perhaps they should start listening to us.
And I think there's a necessity for equality in that as well. Equality in dialogue, equality in listening. Too often what happens when there is a disagreement, whether it's women not listening to men and the third wave of feminism evolving into this extreme, taking this very extreme trajectory, or it's men not listening to women. I think that dialogue needs to be open on both sides, and that's the fundamental, that is what is going to cause a fundamental paradigm shift. So we have our last comments from Lindsay, and I think we're ready to close the session after that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Shahzadi Mariam Binte Shahan from Bangladesh, a school student. My question is actually in Bangladesh, there are many vulnerable and poor families where the members of the family thought that daughters are a burden and they should be married rather than being established. Even some daughters and girls have no complaints about this kind of view. So I want to know that in these cases, what the organizations, social organizations can do, and does the ActionAid have any plan about them? Thank you.
Yeah.
I second that.
So Lindsay, over to you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the questions that were asked really have elements of really understanding where we are now, so baselining exactly where we're starting, and then looking to actual practical measures to mitigate each of these risks to the goals that we're trying to achieve, developing shared goals through that dialogue, through conversation, through respectful discourse, like even allowing for disagreement within other groups of women, within women and men, and not making that a matter of demonizing somebody for
Absolutely.
not being inclusive. I think that we have to really be careful of developing approaches that force people into positions that they are uncomfortable with, because we've seen it historically that extremely adverse effects come from that in the workforce, in society.
Absolutely.
So I think really fostering this continuous dialogue through government and special task forces with the youth, it's important for us to hear their voices, to hear their concerns and understand their perspective. For women, for people of color or indigenous populations, for LGBTQ people in the workforce, or as entrepreneurs, I think that that diversity of needs, of challenges, can only really be unearthed if you're fostering that continuous dialogue in the way that embeds constant feedback loops into all of your systems across business and government. So I think that continuing this conversation well after we're done here is going to be absolutely imperative. So I welcome anyone who wants to continue the dialogue again to see us after.
So thank you so much to everybody. Thank you so much to the ORF and to BIISS for having us over here. Conversations like the Dhaka Global Dialogue and these kind of dialogues should be a perennial way to improve the concept of inclusivity and bring all of us onto that equal platform. And thank you so much to all my fellow panelists for your time and for your thoughts today.
Please join me in applauding, I think, the best panel of the dialogue. So thank you very much, Vrinda and the panelists. We need to have more of these conversations. I also thought that since we were talking about bringing and actually acknowledging the contributions of a much larger set of people, this is also the time, before we move to the last panel, to acknowledge a whole team of young scholars and colleagues from the Bangladesh Institute of International Security Studies and ORF, who have put this all together. And they've remained largely nameless and faceless. They've not been getting the mic time, but they have made sure that all of us did. And I think we should, at this time, perhaps acknowledge them. I think this is a young team that has put it all together. So please join me in giving them a loud round of applause for these 2.5 days of work. And they're all standing there. Can you raise your hands so that we can see you all there? Can you, everywhere? Can you all stand up so you can do that? I initially wanted to bring them all on stage, but we'll try and do that towards the very end. I couldn't see all of them in the room, but that's an organization challenge itself, to create all the organizing team at the same space, because they're trying to manage different elements. Couple of housekeeping announcements for international departures. Go to the reception, contact them, and they will arrange for your drop-off to the airport. Also, there are the unfinished memoirs of the Father of the Nation available in the book stall outside. For the international delegates, please pick up your copy and do carry that. It's a must read for all of us who are engaging with this dynamic. Please.
First of all, it's been fantastic, and thank you for inviting. We're not climate sensitive. This room is like the North Pole, and I'm not sure we needed it. And it's also not, it's so cold that it's not gender sensitive. Women don't necessarily come in their jackets and coats. So,
thank you for saying that.
Yes, so next time, this should be something to be considered. And I see plastic bottles all around. Every one of us have to make that effort. If you are serious about climate, if you don't understand climate, well, I have nothing to say. But if you are serious about your life and this planet, get rid of the plastics.
So no plastics and no air conditioners. That's the next format of the Dhaka dialogue. Can you all join us for a photograph, please? Thank you. I know a couple of you have to rush to the airport, so we'll make it quick. And we'll break for 15 minutes for tea and come back with the closing panel with the foreign ministers, the State Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a couple of other dignitaries. So please join us for a quick cup of tea and come back for the final session. And I promise you, this is the final session. Do come back.